I'm Ashley Baird, and I was assigned Chapter 1, What is Deviant Behavior? Chapter 1 starts off talking about the 2016 election. It brings up Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and all the different rumors and scandals that arise during the election. As we keep going through the chapter, the introduction of Chapter 1, we get to learn some background story of one of the writers of the book, Alex Theo. We learned who he was and why he was that way. Theo lived in Malaysia and Indonesia during the 1940s. Theo's parents were Chinese, and in Malaysia, the secret police were a part of the Suk Ching, which was a mass killing of their people. In Indonesia, the Indonesian War of Independence lasted from 1945 to 1949. Both events consumed most of Theo's childhood. The book goes into a tragic event that Theo and his mother endured one evening. Theo and his mom witnessed the brutal murder of his father and older brother by the secret police. After this incident, Theo's life changed. There were no questions answered about why it happened, and it almost seemed as if nobody even cared about it anyways. Suk Ching was traumatic, but it was considered the normal. Due to all these tragic events Theo was put through, it really shaped how he perceived deviance. Theo became a sociologist and dedicated 4 decades to exploring the theory of deviance and how deviance ranges different for every person. As we keep going through the introduction of the topic of what deviance means, the meaning gets brought up a lot. For others, there's quite a deal of disagreement of what exactly the meaning is. In fact, the biggest group of people that disagree are sociologists. This is due to the different kinds of properties that make up the deviant behavior. Deviance can be thought of as various different outlooks. For example, some say it's a violation of any social rule. Some say that it's more than a violation of rule and provokes disapproval and anger. Others argue that an individual can be deviant without violating any rules. On the other hand, there are people who think that deviance doesn't have to be conceived as any negative connotation, but can also represent something positive. Some sociologists consider this an oxymoron. With all that being said, however, whether deviance is positive or negative, it's considered real. Obviously, there will be others who disagree with the above statement, because they think that technically deviance doesn't have to be real in order for behaviors or conditions to be labeled deviant. A huge factor that some sociologists link together with deviance is power. Basically, when people are labeled as powerful, either by themselves or by the influence of public opinion, they get labeled by others as deviant often. This also contributes as to why those who are considered powerless engaged in more acts of deviance. There are 2 opposing perspectives to consider while we're talking about deviance: the positivist perspective and the constructionist perspective. Let's consider what being a positivist means. It's associated with the sciences like chemistry, biology, physics. As for how this relates to deviance is, it means that it's like real. This term can also be called the objectivist, absolutist, normative, determinist, and essentialist. As for the constructionist perspective, it's fundamental in the humanities, such as art, language, philosophy. As a constructionist, you'll define deviance as a social construction. It's an idea by society to some behavior. This term can also be referred to as a humanist, subjectivist, and relativist. Some sociologists will lean more towards one term, or some will even combine both of them into a theoretical approach. It really comes down to what that certain person believes in. As the chapter continues, we go back to the positivist perspective. Sociologists who view deviant behavior in this perspective view it as an attribute that inheres in the individual. Positivism relates back to the early study of criminology. However, in today's study, there's an interest in genetic and biological factors that could cause deviant behavior and or crime. The sociologists who believe in positivism has abandoned the use of biological and physical traits to see the difference between criminals and non-criminals. Since the positivist considers deviance real, they focus their study on deviant behaviors in people than of non-deviants who label others as deviant. To put things in better perspective, to a positivist, the deviant behavior is labeled as an observable object. It's something that can be studied objectively. This makes positivist sociologists think they can study deviance like natural scientists can study physical phenomena. Sociologists tried to follow the scientific rule that all their ideas about deviant behavior should be subjected to public test, meaning others could analyze said ideas to see if they were supported by facts. In the past, they used the term evil, immortality, moral failing, and demoralization to describe deviance. They've replaced those terms to normal violation, ritualism, rebellion, and conflict. To make those terms a reality, sociologists use official reports and statistics, clinical reports, surveys of self-reported behavior, and surveys of victimization. However, because a lot of deviant acts are never revealed or discovered, these approaches to learn more about deviant behavior isn't always accurate. Despite being flawed, it's still useful for determining some part of the totality of deviant behavior. Positivists believe that deviance is determined or caused by forces beyond one's own control. Early on, sociologists thought that animals, plants, and material objects that natural scientists study, humans do not have free will. The simple act of even acknowledging one's free will would go against the principle of determinism. So, because of all this, sociologists denied free will ever existed. Continuing on with what sociologists know now, they assume that humans possess free will. However, it's not that simple. Sociologists that practice positivism and acknowledge free will think that no matter how much a person uses their free will with making choices and decisions, they don't just happen, but are determined by a cause. To go more into depth, although positivists believe in human choice, they more commonly than not will attribute deviance to human choice. They'll explain deviance with concepts as to why said individual did said deviant act. The positivist perspective on deviant behavior consists of 3 assumptions. The first is that the deviance is absolutely real. The second is deviance is an observable object. And third, deviance is determined by forces beyond the individual's control. Now that we've gone over the positivist perspective of Chapter 1, let's get into the constructionist perspective. This theory basically was invented to challenge the positivist perspective. The perspective simply means that an act that appears different only appears that way because some people think it's deviant. People will label a certain behavior deviant, therefore no label, no deviant behavior. Constructionists think deviance is unreal, so they don't study it often. There is a relative to a given norm or standard of behavior. The term beauty is in the eye of the beholder is something that constructionists relate back to deviance. Unlike positivists who consider deviance as something living, a deviant person has conscious feelings, thinks, and reflects. If you're a constructionist, then you'll insist that there's a difference between humans and non-human beings and things. Another thing that separates the two is control over the objective knowledge. This one practice violates the views of what a constructionist believes. They advocate for the protection and want to grow the human worth, dignity, and freedom. In other words, one will believe that we need to understand the internal actions and not just the objective view of the observer. Constructionists need to believe we need to understand the life of a deviant, and in order to do so, they'll need to appreciate and have empathy for the deviant. Going back to when we talked about power, the nature and the deviant stigma isn't isolated to celebrity status. However, through power and influence does come into play. They think deviant behavior is a voluntary act, a will, or choice. A constructionist doesn't agree with the positivist view, which implies that the human being is like a robot, senseless, purposeless machine reacting to what's going on in their environment. However, as a constructionist, they believe that human beings determine their own behavior. They like to analyze how social control agencies define deviance and how they pursue action against it. They also analyze others who have already been labeled as deviant. Basically, this perspective consists of 3 assumptions. The first is that deviant behavior is labeled. Second, deviant behavior is a subjective experience. Lastly, deviance is a voluntary, self-willed act rather than one caused by forces. The best way to know the most about deviance is to have an understanding of both perspectives, even though both are very opposite and different, and the difference are largely emphasized. By giving one side consideration, we don't deny the reality of the other. In simpler terms, one cannot exist without the other. Both perspectives are equally important and can be used differently for certain acts of deviance. If we consider the acts of murder, rape, or armed robbery, then the positivist perspective fits best. For acts that aren't considered very serious, such as prostitution, drug users, and tax evaders, you'll want to use the constructionist perspective. One could describe deviant behaviors as any behavior considered deviant. By public consensus, which may range from maximum to minimum. However, the book states that deviance should be viewed as an act located somewhere one continuum from total conformity of one extreme to total deviance at the other. Since the U.S. consists of so many different groups, everyone won't agree on one thing, what deviant means. There is a lot of gray areas. So deviant behaviors mean being more or less rather than completely. With this in mind, the book divides deviance into 2 types. There's a higher consensus deviance, which is the type that is mostly studied by positivist sociologists. The other type is a lower consensus deviance, which is the type that constructionist sociologists study more. Nowadays, positivists and constructionists actually agree with something in that you need to combine both theories in order to get somewhere. As the chapter ends, the book states that sociology and criminology, although both study deviance, are very different and focus on very different things. While sociology studies deviance in all aspects, criminology only studies deviance involving crime. And that is basically the end of the chapter. Thanks for listening.